everyone, I'm Sarah Christensen from When Sages View Astrology, and welcome. I am doing a Bridgerton series looking at Eros and Psyche for our co-leads of season 3 with Nicola Coughlan and Luke Newton. Today I'm focusing a bit more on Luke Newton. I've done his birth chart from the information that we have with a whole sign house system, and we'll continue running with that. There is a potential for another chart. If he was born later that day, he may have a Virgo rising and he may have a Leo moon. That is a possibility with his Aquarius sun. I will discuss that as a potential later and how that looks, but it's a smaller probability than the Leo rising sign that Nicola seemed to point out in that BuzzFeed interview. So I want to discuss today a couple of charts for Luke that are tied to some of the events, but also looking at his progress chart, because in the progress chart is some information I think is really valuable as it relates to the total solar eclipse that was on April 8th. And I believe he was in Los Angeles, but he could have been in another spot, but he was not in the total eclipse, like complete totality zone. He was in LA, and I don't believe that was completely in the zone. I'd have to look at the percentage. But what I want to point out is there's something happening very significant to Luke in his own progressions related to that event, the total solar eclipse, because of the Venus in his progress chart. So we'll dive into that first so I can show you that. And I will jump to just kind of exploring different themes as it relates to that. We're focusing on Eros and Psyche, but I'm bringing up a lot of other things. Now, I'm starting to build a list of things that people want me to cover. I will maybe put something on the community page so you can see that and kind of know where I'm going. So I can share, I can only create so fast. So I can answer your questions and do some creation over the summer. Okay. Yeah. So hopefully you get a little bit of astrology out of this. If you're interested in exploring your own astrology, you're welcome to contact me through my website, onesagesview.com. And the information is going to be in the details below of the notes of this video. So let's get started and checking out Luke's detail for a few events and his progressions. All right, we're going to jump into Luke's detail, and here we go. All right, so I wanted to go over his progressed chart first and point out the details of Venus, because Venus by progression in Luke's chart is showing me some interesting things about his Venus in Aries right there at 19. And that is the exact degree of the total solar eclipse on April 8th of 2024. And I wanted to point that out because when it's in the progress chart, you also have, if you take that down and you come down here, it's a square to these planets of his natal chart in his 6th house. And 6th house, traditional astrology, 6th house is the house where accidents happen. It's kind of bad fortune house, where 11th house is good fortune house. In evolutionary astrology, we don't really look at it like that. We look at, yes, it is in aversion to the ascendant. There's something to be noted for that, because the ascendant is what is visible, what is like supporting the life. And when it's in the 6th house, it's kind of in the blind spot. So in evolutionary astrology, we look at the 6th house as a place of where we might have a master and a student, or a, like a guru and a disciple kind of relationship. So there's mentor mentee type of relationship. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the Venus is involved here, like in that kind of way. But what can happen is there's a higher lesson being initiated at this point, because Venus is very much going to have the total solar eclipse kind of take the energy away from the sun, because everything is energized by the sun, and then have it kind of like turned on, turned off, right? So to me, there's this moment, and he doesn't necessarily control in his free will things of Uranus and the Neptune in Capricorn. He's part of more of a collective in that, and he's doing something through his work, or how he uses his Saturn, which is here in his 7th house. So that to me is those work relations. These are committed relationships, like really close people that you have a committed you're either committed by some contractual agreement, like as a business partner. This is awesome. Also the commitment of a spouse and like someone as a significant other. Okay. So lovers tend to be more 5th house, pleasure, lovers, these kind of things. Friends, real personal friends are more a 3rd house kind of detail. And I've heard 11th. 11th to me is more social friends, these kind of like larger groups of friends, where you might be, and also like a collective group of friends. Like there's like something about 11th house to me is friends to the, also ancient astrology or more Hellenistic astrology, traditional astrology has the 11th house in that good fortunes because it rises to the 10th, and it's like the friend to the king kind of thing concept. Because he has the Jupiter down here in his natal chart, he has that strong Jupiterian touch into his relationships anyway. So there's this kind of a lot of pleasure goes into, or his creativity, and those close enough friends can be involved there because of the nature of his work or who he connects with because of his passions, right? So there's that tie, and I think that's important to, take into consideration. So I just want to point those out, because this Venus by progression, which means he is 31 years of age when he turned 31 in February of 2024 on the 5th. And this year, and we could also look at his solar return for this year, but this year would be, of course, significant for him in terms of him getting a big stage and things kind of blowing up in his life in a bigger way. But the Venus in Aries it can be that he's projecting this Venus onto a female or someone who he, kind of admires and has that kind of connection with from a relationship standpoint. But Venus is, not only is responsible for kind of like how we like symbolize our love nature, but it's also how we kind of think about it. It's kind of like how our perception is of it as well, because it's kind of like we think and then we are. But Venus in Aries is more inclined to go get something or attracted to someone who's like that. So you can have both scenarios. You can have him being attracted to the woman who is more likely to go get, and so she has an Aries kind of detail in her chart, or, of course, in a heterosexual relationship we're talking about here. And in the case of like, that's the anima, the male person projecting that anima on, and getting that through that partner. So I think it's interesting to kind of look at what is Venus doing in his progress chart. So 31 days after Luke was born, we would see this Venus sitting at 19 degrees, moving forward from when he was born, it was at 2 degrees of Aries. So this is where Venus has progressed over time. So it's very important to understand the timing, because timing tells us so much in astrology, because it's not causal. It's more the synchronicity of what is happening in our lives and what is synchronously going on within us, within our inner world and our outer worlds, and how, all that stuff collides together. So we have, with Venus having this kind of moment in 2024 where in his progress chart it gets eclipsed like that, he's having an eclipse detail of something in his career, because Venus is responsible for his career. So there's some kind of eclipsing moment, and he has to work through that because this is his idea of what he finds attractive. So things before the eclipse were one way, eclipse happens, and then something starts changing up for him because there's an internal on-off switch that's going on with Venus. It is actually stronger in Luke's chart than it is in Nicola's chart from the eclipse standpoint that I can figure out so far. And that's because of the Venus involved. Now, I think because of that, and it comes at a square to this, it's almost like, I think I may have mentioned it in another video, Nicola and Luke have kind of an interesting relationship about, and I've heard them mention it, about how he's learning about handling some kind of levels of fame from her because of maybe what she experienced with Dairy Girls. Now, there is extremes of differences, I think, between what Dairy Girls, that kind of jump up to fame, and what Bridgerton has done. And so he leans on, maybe she has an assuredness to her, and I think that assuredness comes through the amount of earth that is in her chart that gets her feet on the ground, and she can deal with things a little bit more with a stable foot on who she is as a person. Where someone with lots of fire, lots of air, in like he has, he can get lit up, but he can also be attracted to things quickly in like, and we perceive that in the videos of the interviews of how we are picking up on that ball of energy that is also part of Nicola's chart, lots of fire in her chart as well. And he picks up on that, and all his air, all the cerebral in his chart picks up on that, feeds off of it too. So it's kind of like making it more abundant between when they're together. Right. And so it's a lot of energy. Another thing in the progress chart, I really am not paying attention to the midheaven because we don't have an exact time. And I'm not paying attention to this one either because we don't have an exact time. So those are going to be slightly different, right? The moon can be slightly different as well in the progressions. And so I'm always keen to kind of like, okay, where's the moon? It's at 25 degrees if he was born exactly as I have it. But I think that could move a little bit either way, depending on exact time of birth, because we do use progressions to kind of calculate time of birth. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of the importance. Like the progress chart is time slowed down in a different kind of, now these are all the same positions of the planets 31 days after he was born. Okay. The fastest moving thing that we have in progressions is the moon. This could be slightly, this way or that way. I don't know until I have an exact birth time, but that's important to note the Venus, because the Venus is such an important planet when it comes to the synastry between Luke and Nicola, and because his Venus connects to her Mars, and it's really significant how they play off each other and what we see in them. Another thing in his progress chart, which is like, wow, okay, that's interesting, because his sun, another thing that we look at in progressions, has moved by progression up to 18 degrees of Pisces. And also on that is Mercury. Mercury by progression has gone into the retrograde. I'll have to go look at the dates of that because that would be in 1993, 31 days later. So we're talking about sometime in March. I'll have to look in the ephemeris for that. But what I found really interesting was this whole block of energy in his progress chart sitting on a key planet for her, which is Jupiter in Pisces. And it was connected up through her Eros and Psyche opposition in her chart. So in his progressions, we have these really interesting things happening in the timing of everything. And we also have Ceres, which is an interesting dwarf planet, asteroid, whatever you want to call. But Ceres, I kind of look at as there's a little bit of grief in there, sadness. I look at Ceres as also something that might feed us, but there's also something that could be a little bit sad about it. There could be a feeling of loss here. And we have also by progressions, and I don't really often look at Black Moon Lilith or anything like that when it comes, but when they're so close to the mix with the sun, I kind of like, definitely is flavoring the progressed sun in Pisces. There's also kind of dark feminine symbolism in the shadows that is also emerging from the moment. So that means, in May, when the release was happening, this is kind of the makeup on another level of his consciousness. Now, some things are very conscious, some things are kind of being realized, and some people are very aware of, wow, this is moving in a unique direction. And they may, I know that during the tour, the promo tour, that when they were in Australia, he was introduced to his astrology chart through Nicola asking. So I think that was an awakening, but I think he was already in the relationship with Antonia at the time. Absolutely, in April. I believe the pictures at the observatory were like April 7th, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. I've tried to do a little bit of research, but that's always hard to know exactly what day that was, right? But based on other posts and things, it looks like it was. So that was one day before the eclipse. So I'm just interested to kind of pull the threads on the symbolism here, because even when they were working in 22 and 23 to film Nicola, Jesus, that's not right. Nicola and Luke were filming in 22 and 23, season 3. This would have been a progression will start, becoming more and more exact to its perfect square with this part of his chart. And so there's something about what she may be teaching him, right? So there might be this soul level of, I'm teaching you something. I think that's a possibility, but it's not just them two, but because it's Uranus and Neptune, it's almost like there is a collective participation in the visibility of that kind of teacher student, what's going on. It's almost like observing the classroom of sorts. And the volume of interest that's happening with season 3, I think there's a strong potential of learning so much more about us, how we can understand astrology or even understand the tarot or oracle readings, because there's been so much interest in it. To each their own, right? But I think that I care about using anything that we are perceiving as a potential something to teach, right? Like I look at it that way as myself. I have sun in Sagittarius in the 9th house. I am very much a teacher. And astrology gives us so much insight into a moment and what might be going on in people's lives. Now, until we have the access to exact birth times, we have to kind of look at things a little bit loosely because of the potential of having different angles and things like that are really important. But I think Nicola's is pretty solid. I think Luke's has a potential for having a little bit of different outcomes if he is a Virgo rising and Leo moon. But there's still very strong touch points that still give us the mirroring detail that we are experiencing, even if that's the case. And that's because the psyche for Nicola is in Virgo and her vertex also in Virgo. So there could still be this strong connection just through that part if there's that connection between their charts. And also how that might map up into that whole psyche Eros opposition in Nicola's chart. So Nicola's chart is so significant. Luke is interesting of how it plays into the whole picture as well. It's just like these puzzle pieces coming together. But progressions are so powerful because they last longer. So this Venus at 19 will be there in the progressions for a while. And so it's kind of like pay attention to that. Another very important thing about progressions is how they exact to one planet and then the next planet. So Venus by progression not only has the transit event of the total solar eclipse, okay, in April of 2024, and that brings on an on-off on what he is connecting to in terms of what he finds desirable or how he finds a certain adoration for someone and how that is progressing or whatnot. So he's known Nicola a longer period of time, so there can be a change up in what's the next level and where does that friendship, where is it going? Are there other things involved in the friendship underneath? And does this Venus affect that total solar eclipse affect that connection? I think if there was a love nature not yet turned on until after, maybe when they were traveling into late April I think they were in Australia in late April around I think they landed in like April 21st, April 20th, 21st, right around there, 22nd. And so they were starting the tour with Jupiter and Uranus starting a new cycle by their conjunction in Taurus, which is huge because that is opposite his psyche, right there. So I think I want to point that out because the progressions last longer. And it's really important to kind of keep in mind that transits are like triggers to the progressions. And I think that's really, really important because his sun is on Nicola's Jupiter, his Mercury is on her Jupiter, and that is really important. But we also have Ceres and Black Moon Lilith in progressions touching into the transiting Saturn of the moment. So there can be karma as a part of that understanding. And there can also be a different evolutionary choice that's happening. Maybe it's unfolding. I don't know explicitly because I like to have exact birth times, of course. But I think what we are witnessing and observing is we're dissecting this thing into, it's very Virgo in terms of how we're looking at this relationship and what it is that we saw on the screen, the Psyche and Eros storyline kind of embedded in all of it, and what we are picking up on the co-leads and other co-stars that are also interacting with them when they're in interviews, in the promo. So I think that's important to point out. Now, as that moon, because this is, 2024, as that moon progresses deeper into Virgo and then moves when it switches up into Libra, it's a different energy for Luke. And it starts building towards being conjunct his own Jupiter. But that would take about a year, or actually maybe even longer than that. That's a little bit over a year. So because it takes 2.5 years to go through a whole sign, for the moon to go through a whole sign in its transit, in terms of its progressions, excuse me. So I think that's important because eventually that progressed moon will catch up to his Jupiter. And then that sun will, at some point, there's a Cazimi happening with the progressed Mercury with the sun. They come together so close that the Mercury is in the chariot with the sun in the progressions. Now, this is something we pay attention to when we have Mercury in its retrograde cycle and when it actually conjoins the sun and it sits in the chariot. And so it's important because it's almost like the messenger. And then once that comes out, then there's visibility of what was going on behind the scenes. I always tell that to people when they're in readings with me, is you really, from a transit, this is progression, so it takes longer to see something, but the transits definitely will show that. So when the Mercury meets up with the sun during its retrograde cycle, both going into the retrograde and coming out of it, there's 2 times that we have a gazemi with that. And so there's messages that we can receive if we're asking for something to have an answer around it, and then coming out, and then have a visibility to it as it goes beyond, so that when it becomes visible in the skies again. This is so important. I think it's so important that when you go and ask for something in the desire, or to have an understanding of something, even if it's about the self or someone else and your connection to someone else, if we are kind of wanting to understand that and we're really focusing on it, that's when we can get kind of an awareness and understanding of ourselves be expanded upon. But we might not see the thing until it goes by movement. It's just how things work. That is important. So from a progressed standpoint, that Mercury can just be touching through the sun, and it takes a really long time for it to move beyond. So this in Luke's chart, if truly Leo rising, is happening in his 8th house. So there might not be visibility for a long time. But what it's interesting to see is that it's touching on interesting communication and imagination, Pisces, and even Pisces is even too much substances. Okay. If you drink too much, or if you have some kind of other substances, that could be a too muchness thing. But in the positive, it's more looking at where you're going in the inner plane of yourself to understand, to expand yourself and to go in the directions of your desires and your dreams and what you're pursuing for your own, acting on your authentic self-will and moving forward in your life. But this is an interesting combination, because to me, it is pointing once again to Nicola's chart. Now, I haven't compared this to Antonia's chart, but definitely with Nicola's chart. Okay. And it also is I've kind of pondered a few questions with these placements of the sun in Mercury in Pisces and the Venus in Aries. And here were my questions. And one of them was, okay, did it turn on off a past desire nature that kind of clicked off and is clicking back on when it came back online? And how long does it take to go back online? And is there kind of, it needs the space to, but maybe not needs the space, it only becomes aware of it by the space. Maybe that's a better way to say. There's an awareness that only comes because there was space that was given, and the opportunity to come back together can be completely different than the next time. I hope that makes sense. But there could be there's a choice that's been made as well. That's also a potential, but it depends on how strong the desire is, and if the other person also has same desire to actually meet up with that. It has to be energy that reconnects. Right? There is a reconnection potential, but it kind of, there's other elements that to keep in mind, because of we make other commitments to other people. That can be a part of things. So timing, and some people maybe ask the question, are they fated? Are they destined? They already have had the experience to be fated or destined. That's already in our view by playing the co-leads. That's easy to see and a no-brainer, but also picked up heavily and made things even exponentially more incredible in terms of how many streams, the interest, the storyline, the sweetness of the story. But I think there's more to it that is going on behind the scenes that I think there is an awareness, but there are certain levels of awareness where, I mean, you can understand this when you have a group of friends and you know that 2 people like each other, but there's, these missing ships in the night. They're not connecting like what you see, right? You may see it because you have a different point of view, a different point of perception. But when they're face to face or whatnot, there's something that maybe blocks that because there's just been hard boundaries put around something, right? And so I've heard it said by a few people that perhaps each of them really fell in love with the character that they were playing and they love their characters. But is it just the character characters, right? So there needs to be space put in to kind of register, is there still that same kind of attraction and same kind of, I don't know, just that beauty of like, and the desire wanting to be together that's there even outside of the characters, right? I think because the pressure's off when they go into the next season 4 in filming and they're not the lead, they have such more space, because you look at their parts in season 1, season 2, and how it must have felt completely different in terms of how much they had to be in the film, you know, how much filming, how much time in, you know, makeup chairs and things like this to be on the screen for the filming and the production of season 1 and season 2, but not the same as season 3. So they're going to have a bit more relaxed, but still have an, you know, coming back together to do their scenes. But will they share the trailer again? Will they do the same kind of behaviors as they did before? Who knows? But there is this interesting mix that kind of makes me go, there's definitely some kind of learning that's is happening at the soul level. And there's a learning about the desire nature of the self. That's the Venus for Luke. And for Nicola, it's the Mars and what she projects onto someone. When we pull the projection back, I think there's an evolutionary thing going on in terms of, well, how do we own all parts of our chart and allow them to be exactly what they are? And there's still the desire to connect, but we own our stuff, and there's like complete ease in that. And I think there's an ease, but there still seems to be, at least from our visibility, things could be very different behind closed doors. And they're both very intelligent individuals. And so there is an awareness, I think, with Nicola that she would know how to not be seen in public, right? I think at a certain point you would learn these tricks through others. And there's also, I think, with Nicola and her strong internet that she does, that she also knows about creating a certain image beyond that keeps things going in a certain direction. She's very powerful of understanding image and what fan or a fandom would want beyond probably any other castmate. I think she's the strongest in that knowledge because how she engages the public. Okay, so back to Luke. I think that is so important that we will see this kind of interesting mix over this next year. Another thing about the Venus has had some interesting transits. Last year, Venus is retrograde in September, October timeline. Now, they were done filming at that point, I believe, but they might have had some callbacks maybe in the summertime. I can't remember when they were doing callbacks, but I think there was something happening with Luke during that retrograde of the Venus during that time in 2023. So I don't know exactly the dates of when he was separated, the relationship with Jade, and that was a very long relationship, 4 years, I believe. And I think any relationship that immediately comes after it is a bit of wanting something to have someone in your life, and yet it might not have worked out all the things from the previous relationship because a lot of time hadn't passed, and you do that when you're younger. So you just jump right back in, but it doesn't mean that you resolved maybe what was going on before. Another thing that I didn't point out in my video about his natal chart is that his square to Mercury in his chart, which is really powerful. It's really, I want to draw this out so people can see it. This is really important. This Mercury is such an interesting planet as it relates to this Pluto at 25 Scorpio, and you have Saturn square also. See how close they are? Those are totally kind of grouping together. And then the Psyche in Scorpio and Pluto in Scorpio. So I think it's important to kind of keep in mind about his natal chart that the storyline was just picking up stuff off of his own chart. So the storyline with jealousy that was happening in the show. But if you go back in season 1, is kind of his immaturity and his innocence that got him into trouble with, I think the character was Marina. And it's kind of interesting to kind of go back in the story a bit to see that, yeah, we're kind of noticing he's first connecting and it's friendly and warm in terms of how he connects with Penelope in the very beginning. But of course, she has really a strong desire and interest. But what I think is interesting is his meandering way through the seasons to even understand himself about what he really has, where he finds his comfort to where he finds his love. Now, people say, well, it's just a story. Yeah, But actors, a lot of astrologers do actors because we have access to the information and they're a celebrity. And when you have someone who's visible to the public, there's a stronger pull on the archetypes. And so when you look at the storylines that they do in their career, you can actually see things that they choose by the projects, by what's really focused in their chart at any given point in time. And it actually kind of brings it forward. So not only are they acting it out for their career, they're acting out something that maybe the collective consciousness is a part, getting attracted to reflect on that thing, right? So they play a part in that whole, like, we're going to bring something forward that you're going to be thinking about now. And in Luke's natal chart, that is, he's part of the group who has the millennials who have that really strong combination of Neptune and Uranus in Capricorn. Group of souls born at that time in the 90s, the early 90s, when they have the Uranus and Neptune and his are conjunct. So they're so powerful in his chart, and what it picks up on and what it touches when things are transiting or by progression and so forth. It is his participation as a larger figure in that collective, a bigger collective, because it goes beyond his generation, how he touches into it, and how Bridgerton, part of his work, is actually helping loosen really strict things in conservative society, or how it could have been different. Like, given an imagination, look at what Bridgerton does in terms of the cast and how it blends the storyline of a completely different looking Regency, and just how Shonda and Julia Quinn allowing that flip in her stories, because that flip happened through the Netflix Bridgerton series, not in the books. Okay, that's important here. It wasn't ready. The timing wasn't ready in early 2000s. It's ready now. Okay, but it had to have an author who would be like, yeah, I'm okay with that being completely rewritten in a different kind of way for it to be picked up by them, right? So that makes me think that, yeah, Julia Quinn and Shonda have interesting charts because their birthdays are so close together. But in terms of Luke, he's definitely picking up on that, breaking old paradigms of the mind. But he has his own, because there's a whole group of souls doing it. Like, the entire millennial people get angry, like older generations might get angry with millennials for not doing it their way, but it's built in their whole makeup. It's the whole point for what is to emerge. And he's participating through his work, but it also is a part of his daily routine, something he does differently in his daily life, but it's also something beyond. It's very transpersonal. So he's got something in his sixth house that can be difficult to manage in his daily routines too, because of that amount of energy sitting in his sixth house. Sixth house can also have accidents and things like that, kind of signatures there. Is that a part of Luke's life, this life? I'm not going to predict that. I'm going to say that Saturn in his chart is well positioned in the seventh house. It's more that if you have this volume of energy and the ruler of that is over here in the seventh, or if it was in the eighth, or if it was even in the sixth, that is something that's happening to somebody else connected to him. Okay. And so there's something about that energy that can get picked up, but there are fixed thoughts about it. But there is also Saturn in Aquarius is going to do it differently. It's going to be different than the status quo. So there are multiple themes of, I'm going to be doing it much differently than what people think I'm going to do. And so when it comes to partners, that's part of the makeup that's going on in his consciousness. There's a lot of consciousness around traditional thinking about how we have a relationship, how we commit into a relationship, women and men, women and women, men and men, whatever, right? Like he's here as a part of a group to break it up. And it's like, this is different. And we are maybe witnessing that through Nicola and Luke's connection, that they've identified themselves as the very best of friends, even best friends. Some people put that on a trajectory and say, well, that can turn into, significant other, and they want to have, want you to get married and have babies. But that's the traditional thinking, the thinking of that's the path, that's always the path to take. But I don't think so. I think this is very different. I think the way that he may connect in relationships, and he may struggle with that thinking because he has the Mercury square the Pluto. There's a redefinition of what is family. What does it look like? Is it a nuclear family? Is it something else? I mean, it might be that a lot of millennials I have friendships with or observe were brought up with that in certain terms of, but many have just groups of friends and that's their family, right? Because their family of origin was very difficult to like relate to. And so they go off and make their own family units. So there's something that can also be a part of the mix here as we look at Luke Newton and partners. And so I'm kind of like, we may see that in how he over time may show up with a relationship. And he's also trying to work out something as it pertains to his own identity in relationships. Like how's that connection? How are we committed? What does that look like? We might do something very different than what the collective looks at, right? So I think that's valuable to bring up, okay? So people may be asking me questions about, are they going to get married? Are they going to be together? And these kinds of things. I'm like, well, because of the combination of Aquarius energy and the Uranus and Neptune in his chart is, yes, he's going to have friendships, absolutely deep friends, even though he likes to be alone, but there'll be a few that he, not clings to, but more that he gets to spend more time with. And that's a key here. He has to spend the time with them. And once he can spend the time with them, that makes a better connection. And he's already described of how he would perceive a significant other as someone who can be your complete dorky self with, dance around the kitchen in your underwear or whatever. And, just be all the parts of who you are in front of the person and still feel loved and be loved. And I think that's showing up here. But I don't think it has to be defined how we may have over time been conditioned to think that, oh, we all do this thing, go through a relationship beginning and it has time to mature and then we get married, have children, whatever. I don't think that could be very different. And I want to point that out. A lot of people may not like that answer, but the Bridgerton series allows a lot of the energy to expend in that there's so many different layers within how Bridgerton was presenting Regency storyline that kind of breaks the mold. And that's why it's so popular, I think, in the way it's been done. So I want to point that out. Things may not go in the direction that people think based on the amount of Aquarian energy that's involved in his partnership side of his chart. It could be very different. And Venus in its movement by progression is definitely giving us a storyline of something is definitely happening, especially when he's traveling, because that's in the ninth house, as long as he's Leo rising. Ninth house Venus, which is partly connected to his career, is having a moment where it's completely disconnected from energy of the sun through the total solar eclipse in the transit. So it's kind of happening at that level, but it's activating the Venus when he's traveling. So, but we have it in both cases. I mean, highly, of course, the promo tour, and that's what we're focusing on here. But I also think he's traveled with what appears to be a girlfriend, but not yet fully announced in a formal way from him as far as I know. But there's definitely something to take into consideration there, and it really activates. The one thing that is interesting is I believe that I would name Nicola a personal close friend, and so a friend, like a third house friend, right? And so that to me is a key relationship that relates to his Jupiter and the Venus. And so those combinations make me go, Here's another thing, because I think there's the way people are dissecting every little video on interviews, and of course they're coming in my feed because I keep looking for research and stuff, and I'm curious about, okay, what is that really? Some part is promo, actors doing their thing, but to promote a show. But there's some that I would imagine after 6 months you could PR and be high energy and doing your thing, but there is a part of your real personality just comes through. And I think if you look at the different interviews across the castmates, how different theirs are over the time. But I think the Jupiter part is twofold here, because the Jupiter for him sits in a personal friend sibling house. So I'm going to pull up the personal friend side of it. And Nicola is definitely someone like that in terms of they're so close that they can and they communicate so often. They communicate when they're leaving parties, for example, or that kind of thing. Like they're giving the respect of like, I'm heading out of this party, just letting you know kind of thing. Where we don't have a lot of information on the other relationship, but what the relationship with Nicola has been put before us. And I think it's a blessing to have that, just because it gives us a way to look at all of the astrology, look at and the psychology of this thing. Because what if part of the relationship lesson for Luke Newton with Nicola is around jealousy or envy. I think more jealousy, maybe, that's been suppressed in some way. Maybe they've spoken about it I think someone mentioned in one of the interviews a professional jealousy. I don't even know what that is. Maybe that's just a made up combination of things to just point it out, but not like be so direct. Anyway, I think that's interesting because the Mercury square that Pluto definitely has the connotation of how that may show up, right? In terms of the difficult of the square of the Mercury with the Pluto and the psyche. Yeah. So and Saturn is so close. I would include Saturn in there as that square. And so that's very karmic in its nature. Saturn is like the limits and the restriction part, karma part, like you have a lesson to learn here, right? Mercury is challenged in its fixed thinking about something. So there may be a possessiveness or a jealousy kind of thing that transpiring as it relates to the other person. And that person has to become aware of it. And maybe only become aware of it because other people saw it, can see it or whatnot, even when it's very, very subtle. Now, the question is, how true is it? Or is it just the greatness of an actor always being in that mode of acting for a promo tour? I don't know. It's a good question. But I always like to bring up the question is like, how real is that? Because we have Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, and there's quite an illusion that gets created, and we're participating in that. Also part of his progressed, all that Pisces. So there's something to be said about that as well. So I want to point that out. So in terms of, the progressions for Luke Newton, there are so many things to point out. Oh, another thing with the Jupiter is responsible for the rulership of Sagittarius. And Sagittarius is the house where is his fifth house of creativity, but fifth house of pleasure, fifth house of R&R, relaxation, pleasure. The Venus principle is fifth house. And this is where lovers exist in that as well. And so to me, there is the potential for a personal friend to be a lover, or that your lover will be a personal friend over time. So he's had a long relationship, and now that was before he was 30, as he was 30, and then having to go through the change up of that relationship. It was part of his Saturn return. So I think it's important to point that out, that there was now he could also experience the betrayal from a partner with that combination of Mercury, Saturn, square Pluto. Scorpio gives us the betrayal piece, and it's a communication of some sort, or how that communication breakdown happens, and then that leads to a betrayal of some sort, or there's a potential. So there's different layers of challenging emotional experiences that have to be navigated for the lesson that the soul is working out for its own evolutionary purposes. And it can go, we look back at Mercury. The importance of Mercury here is it's his south node with a collective group of friends, aspiration. I don't know I think it's more group consciousness when we look at the 11th house, friends, allies, visible allies. Some personal friends are not as visible, but they're very much closer to the family kind of thing. The friends of the 11th house to me are more social, larger. And so the Mercury is the ruler of that. And so this kind of pinpoints, this is what Luke is bringing forward. And in his progress chart, when things activate it like that, and in time, it's almost like the clock is striking. This is the moment that this is going to start being activated, and it will play out for you to have the storyline, for you to realize something for the self, to evolve something that you want to evolve, right? Because you got stuck some other time and place around these things. Okay. As that moon moves into Libra, I think it's important to keep the moon moves the fastest in the progress chart. That starts building a trine with all his air. So it changes the vibe. So Earth planets more earthy. The Virgo moon is a little bit more, has a critical eye to the self, or either you're doing the perceiving for yourself, like you're kind of looking at yourself critically, like, okay, I needed to change, I need to do this or that or whatever. Look at my health, very honed in on that. And that to me was the period of time that he was really changing his body, his physical body. Makes total sense there. Now, as it emerges into the Libra and goes through that for 2.5 years, it will trip over his Jupiter for sure for progression. And that when it becomes more exact, that kind of brings in a little bit more of that relationship. So to me, I think that's emerging, right? The other emerging thing is how the moon, as it goes through, will trine to Pluto. Pluto in transit right now is in Aquarius. but it does back up to Capricorn one last time for a little tiny bit from September to November this year. And then it goes from that to, it will send a trine to his sun, and then to trine to his south node, and then a trine to his Saturn, trine to Mercury. And when you have a trine by the progressed moon, it's you might be a Libra moon is very social in terms of it doesn't want to go super deep. It wants to keep things friendly and doesn't like to dive into the depths. So this will be more friendly. This will be like really engaging in that way. And so for 2.5 years, I would see that. But it's going to oppose at the same time his own Venus, like when it enters. And so to me, there's this moment of the moon being very social, but has this, it's almost separated from something about itself for the Venus that it desires. It has a separation with the desire nature. There's been a disconnect. Right. And I think the reconnect comes back online when that progressed moon comes up to the Jupiter. So it will build up to it, and there'll be a peak moment, and then it'll fade away as it goes in. And eventually, as all those trines happen across the sun, the Saturn, etc., and then it has some kind of realization, and then it goes into the underworld again. It goes back into Scorpio, and then it has an underworld, a kind of period of being pulled back, and can be serious and emotional, but more emotional, a little bit turbulence on the emotional level, the feelings. And so that is in the timing of things, right? So over the next 5 years, but I like to focus in like a couple of years. We know that Bridgerton 4 will come out 26, I think. They said 2 years. Okay, that's a long time. That time they have to film again. So the moon will be in the Libra. Relationships, keeping it socially, but there will be a tipping point of some kind of connection into the Jupiter, connection into that. So does it all go professional? Still could, right? But is that the evolutionary thing that's being targeted here? The evolution is to go towards the Jupiter, go towards having a larger philosophy and moving away from the duality, the critical difficulties of the squaring this square, right? So kind of consider it. The moon's going to give the flavor of lifting it up. And that's probably now, because this was back in May. That was very close to tipping over into Libra. So it's probably already there. So this is interesting. And I like to point that out because our progressions give us so much information. The only other thing I can think of is, I didn't point this out, I think, in the other chart of his natal chart, but the lot of fortune for Luke sits in his 6th house. 6th house is kind of where the teacher, the guru, and him being the disciple, learning from that mentor. He's learning from the mentor. And that is his fate, right? Like the Saturn, that Saturn figure, but it's his own Saturn. So he not only has that connection to his father, but I think it's other people in his life that pick up the energy like that pick up the sun in his 7th house. So he learns from partners, and our perception on surface level is one thing. There's a whole nother bunch of business going on behind the scenes or behind the sense of self and things. And astrology can help us pinpoint kind of those themes. But until a person speaks to those things with an astrologer that they want to pursue and dive into these things, or even someone who has a therapist but is forward thinking and maybe brings in astrology too, that they can dive into kind of their transformation that's happening, why the underworld is such an important period of time to actually pull back and then reemerge as you kind of go through the process of integrating something, right? So that's so critical. But that lot of fortune tells us things that happen to us and for us, or very much it's more fate. It's not destiny. To me, lot of fortune is not necessarily destiny like we imagine it. To me, the lot of fortune, when I look at, there's other things called the lot of spirit. That's more career related. I can pull that up later. The lot of Eros, I could also pull it up and look at Eros from a different standpoint. That's another thing I can look at. But this lot of fortune here, part of fortune, is opposite his Mars. And Mars is such an incredible planet as it relates to the Scorpio, as it relates to Aries that his own Venus is square to, right? And possibly his midheaven. Not sure exactly where his midheaven is, but it could float definitely deeper into Aries. I think it could be, I don't think it could be in Pisces, but I think it's more this way. But that opposition is that part of himself, his own Mars, free will, the way he uses his instincts, because the storyline is kind of calling out something in his own subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind about the need to protect and the need to protect, but then how much protection does someone, offer? And if it doesn't go well for them, It's very possible that doesn't go well. A Mars in Cancer, it could be that it didn't go well, trying to protect something, someone, a moon kind of person, a woman. And if that's the case, then there is a struggle with the concept of protecting someone, but you have the desire to. So it's like, I want to protect, I have to prove myself back again by how I protect someone. So a storyline could be created like that. Now, in the story of the actual Bridgerton series 3, we have that in the storyline, a protecting, a protective act, right? But again, actors can play out the protective detail of their chart if it's in the symbolism, kind of archetypally, but how does it carry over in real life? Like, think of someone who may have, that hero complex or protector complex. If they play out that hero, then if someone else tries to play the role of the protector or come in, how that would anger that person, or that jealousy underneath everything can emerge. Because that's the whole point of maybe acting something out, is to see, okay, oh, there's the emotion, now it's brought forward. Here are some interesting things that I explored when I was researching different scenarios of what was in the show versus what might be in real life. It's very hard to get everything that would be real and true in the real life, okay? But I think something behind the scenes, it was mentioned that when the sequence where he goes up to, he's going to tell Colin's going to tell Penelope about, his truth. Like, he's had a conversation with his mother, Mama Bridgerton, and now he's going to ask a question of Penelope. And it's right before she's going to be dancing with Lord Devlin. They get interrupted before he gets to say his truth or say his question. But in that, while he's observing them dancing, not only is all his feeling coming forward, like, I have a question for you, and I'm very, it's now I need to say it now. That gets interrupted. That's the Venus getting interrupted also. And that's going to play in the progressions in the show. Okay. And then that he's on the sidelines now observing the other person. And now he's getting jealous. He's having those jealous looks. He's starting to fume. Okay. So it's playing out on the screen for Colin. So he's here's something I heard. I don't know if it's true or not. This could be completely made up. But did they pull the dancers off one by one? And so eventually they caught Luke Newton's acting of Colin Bridgerton by purposely pulling off dancers off the dance floor. And so it increased his level of emotional expression on his face. Did that really happen? Where dancers were removed so the reaction was greater? And if it's true, I'm like, okay, why would production do that to get the reaction when an actor can just do it? That doesn't make sense to me. Or do they know something? They're like, oh, well, if we do this, we're going to get a even better real reaction. Is that underneath it all? Was he betrayed by people who are in authority in his creativity to bring up emotions? That's kind of an odd choice for an authority figure, but I don't know. Makes you wonder, because I would think if that were true, I would be taken aback as an individual. Be like, excuse me, you did what? And I would really feel like I was betrayed by people. And that's also a bit, that could still be the case, right? But it's hard to tell the truth on this matter. It's just kind of like, I don't know who would really know that, or if that was even put forward by someone other than fans. Was this posted somewhere? Because that's an interesting decision point that as an actor, I would have felt like, okay, I know that in the history of acting, there have probably been scenarios like this where a director or someone responsible for the scene or whatever would make such choices, right? But in this case, I think if Luke Newton knew that, there would be a feeling of being felt like I was vulnerable to that emotion because I have feelings of my dear friend, but maybe more than dear friend. Maybe they know that it's more than a dear friend, and then that was acted upon to make it more. But I don't know. That could just be something to amp up the show. Promo show. Hard to tell. Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. That's there. So anyway, I wanted to kind of point those things out because of that hard square in Luke's chart. With the Mercury and Saturn in Aquarius and the Sun at 16 Aquarius. That is all very important because of what it kind of brings up for Luke to work with. Okay. And he's working with that Mars in sensitive Mars in Cancer, who's really good person, really kind, but underneath it all, there can be frustration, anger, jealousy, these kinds of things because of the square and how people might behave and getting caught up in bigger things, right? I mean, those are all in there. But that could be also, all the things in his chart are also what make him a fantastic actor. So we are multiple layers and layers and layers as individuals. I think it's interesting to point these things out. So if you have something that you know from the questions that I've presented here in terms of that part in season 3 where he's observing them on the dance floor, how do we know what was real about that? If you know more about that, please share, because I don't and I haven't found anything yet. Okay,